At this point, I would like to invite Dr. David Ray Griffin up. Dr. Griffin will bring additional perspective this morning on the questionable science of NIST. Author of The Mysterious Collapse of the World Trade Center 7, Why the Official Report About 9/11 is Unscientific and False. Dr. Griffin is a professor of philosophy of religion and theology, emeritus at Claremont School of Theology and Claremont Graduate University, the author of 36 books, 9 of which are on the subject of 9/11. His most complete statement about 9/11, The New Pearl Harbor Revisited, was Publisher Weekly's Pick of the Week in 2008. His work on the 9/11 issue has prompted his nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. David Ray Griffin.
A recently discovered paper on conspiracy theories by Obama appointee Cass Sunstein has rightly been receiving a lot of negative attention. But this paper also makes an important contribution, pointing out that an idea cannot be rejected simply because it is a conspiracy theory, because there are true as well as false conspiracy theories. We can decide between a true and a false theory, of course, only by examining the evidence. Sunstein says that the government's 9/11 conspiracy theory, according to which the 9/11 attacks resulted from a conspiracy between Osama bin Laden and 19 members of his al-Qaeda organization, is true, while that of the 9/11 Truth movement is false. But he provides no evidence for either claim. The 9/11 Truth movement, however, has presented an enormous amount of evidence to support its claims. For example, in my 2009 book, The Mysterious Collapse of World Trade Center 7, I have shown that the report on this collapse put out by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is unscientific and false. It is unscientific because it can make its major negative claim that the building was not brought down by explosives only by ignoring multiple testimonies about explosions going off in the building, by ignoring a piece of steel from the building that looked like a piece of Swiss cheese, even though fire could not have gotten anywhere close to the temperature needed to melt steel, by ignoring particles of metals in the dust that could have been produced only by extremely high temperatures, and by ignoring the existence of nanothermite. The NIST report is also unscientific because it can make its major positive claim that the building was brought down by fire only by telling rather obvious lies. For example, that a huge fire was burning on the 12th floor at 5 p.m., even though in its 2004 interim report, NIST had a photograph showing this fire to be completely burned out by 4:45, and that the building collapsed because its girders were not connected to the floor slabs with shear studs, even though that same 2004 report indicated that the girders were connected with shear studs. The NIST study is unscientific, finally, because it affirms a miracle in the sense of a violation of basic principles of physics. Only months before NIST put out its final report, its lead investigator, Shyam Sunder, correctly stated that free fall would have been physically impossible in a fire-produced collapse. But after high school physics teacher David Chandler demonstrated in a YouTube presentation that the building came down in absolute free fall for over 2 seconds, NIST affirmed this empirical fact while still maintaining its fire theory of the collapse. It therefore affirmed what it had previously acknowledged to be impossible. The government's theory about the collapse of World Trade Center 7 has therefore been disproved as thoroughly as any theory could be. This is one of the reasons why 1,000 licensed architects and engineers are calling for a new investigation. And let me add that this is a big week for 9/11 Truth. Just this week, 6 major stories have appeared in the Danish press based on interviews with Professor Niels Harrit of the University of Copenhagen's chemistry department, who was the lead author of the paper on nanothermite that Stephen Jones' group had initiated. And the story is getting major coverage in a European country, none in the United States thus far. Secondly, a symposium has just appeared in a major American social science journal called the American Behavioral Scientist. It is now online. This symposium is about what they call SCADs, State Crimes Against Democracy. The book begins by saying, the symposium begins by saying, the silence of due diligence regarding the official account of the 9/11 incidents continued being ignored by scholars of policy and public administration. This symposium also takes aim at the use of the term conspiracy theories to silence all criticisms about crimes originating from people in high places. And finally, I'll talk more about it this afternoon at the luncheon, but it talks about the incredible silence of the Academy in response to what happened to Professor Stephen Jones of Brigham University, who was forced out of his position simply because he wrote a scientific paper that disagreed with the government's interpretation of the World Trade Center collapses. Normally, this would cause an enormous row within the Academy. They said, aside from a peep from the AAUP, there was virtual silence. Thank you very much.
Doctor? Were there pools of molten iron and/or steel in the debris of the Twin Towers and Building 7? This section applies to both. Here we see pouring out of the South Tower, just minutes before its collapse, molten metal by any standard. The official story tells us that this must be molten aluminum from the melted airplane. But molten aluminum looks like molten aluminum. It's silvery, does not glow bright orange and yellow in daylight conditions. Must be molten iron or molten steel. Who says this? As of 21 days after the attack, fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. This is attributed to Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer of the World Trade Center himself. And his associate, Richard Garlock, who says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running, saw pools of literally molten steel, says the lead contractor, the president of the company. And what do these gentlemen say?
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel. Molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano.
Well, the problem with all of this is that the fires, and jet fuel for that matter, which is a hydrocarbon, burns only at about 12, maybe 1400 degrees under ideal fuel-air mixture ratios. Molten steel, molten iron, doesn't begin to even be produced until over 2700 degrees, more than twice that temperature. What could possibly account for these extreme hot temperatures? We'll be looking at thermite, a likely suspect, which produces hot molten iron at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And you'll see what thermite is exactly. It's used to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. Do we have evidence, though, of thermite in the molten metal? Let's see what thermite is, first of all.
Thermite. An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, this is very interesting. It turns out that there's chemical analysis performed on this previously molten metal. This chunk, for instance, a piece of which was sent to Dr. Stephen Jones, whom we'll be hearing from shortly, and he finds that this is predominantly iron. So he rules out aluminum from the jet plane, and it has abundant manganese. So he rules out structural steel as a major component. So it's not melted steel. Where does iron come from? Iron is a part of structural steel, but this is not that. It came from some other source. And it has manganese and fluorine in abundance. This is quite peculiar because manganese is from the potassium permanganate, which is commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. And fluorine is used primarily in sol-gel type thermite charges. These together are the fingerprint of thermite. But what about all of that dust? Laid throughout lower Manhattan, 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized to a fine powder, laid in a blanket 4 to 12 inches thick. Here's some here. It was sent to Dr. Jones, 4 separate samples, one across the street in an apartment, one on top of the skyscraper 2 to 3 blocks away, another one collected just 10 minutes after the collapse on the Brooklyn Bridge. In all of the dust samples, not only the teams of scientists find these, but R.J. Lee, an environmental consultant, and USGS find billions of these spheres. Well, how did they get there? And they're iron, interestingly enough. So they're previously molten. Well, if there were thousands of thermite cutter charges placed throughout the columns and beams, under explosive conditions, it would disperse that thermite, not dissimilar from the spray out of a bottle where its liquid is atomized. It forms itself into a sphere by surface tension. Then it falls and cools and lands with all of the dust. This is the only rational explanation for the billions of these spheres found in the samples. So Dr. Jones does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on the spheres, and he determines that they're curiously similar to ignited thermite from a controlled experiment. Again, USGS finds these spheres. They're iron. R.J. Lee finds them. They're iron. They're about the width of a human hair, very tiny spheres. So Dr. Jones concludes that given the trace metals mixed in here, it's a significant evidence for aluminothermic reactions. Furthermore, he takes the next step that no one had taken, and he asks himself, what would have been in the original chemical makeup of unignited thermite? And would you find any of that in the dust? Well, we'd be looking for powders of aluminum, iron oxide, copper oxide, and other materials. And guess what? He found it.